All right, strategic angling fans, we are back. We are recording. This is episode 40-something of Strategic Angling. My name is Brady Hanna. This is Tanner Bock, Tim Himsl, JJ Patton. First time we had 4 last episode, but we're talking today about the Carolina rig. This is another episode of Strategic Angling presented by K&K True Value in Bettendorf, Iowa. And as always, JJ is going to give us a little history on this rig. And then these two are going to tell us about when and why they use it.
Yeah, guys, I think, you know, why the Carolina rig kind of became popular in the mid-70s. I think it became an issue when guys started using the old Lowrance green box and found offshore structures such as rock piles and ledges and things. And it was kind of the first structure fishing. It was one of those lures that you could use a heavy weight and get it down to it, but yet still present a lure that looked natural to the fish. It was the Bassmaster Classic was won on it by Jack Chancellor back in the 70s, and he was using what was called a do-nothing worm. And this is when I first started fishing. It was about a 4-inch long worm. It had two pre-rigged hooks in it, and that little thing. He won that on I think on the Arkansas River, maybe fishing river ledges with it. But it's kind of came into prominence with offshore structure fishing and ledge fishing and deep rocks, and kind of evolved. I think initially a lot of guys use do-nothing worms or like French fry type baits, and then it kind of went to people using a lot of lizards on it and things with more appendages and more action kind of to get down there. In general, it's a heavy weight, 1/2 ounce or heavier, and then there's kind of you tie the weight and then a bead and then a swivel, and then you have a leader from 12 inches to 4 feet long that the lure will kind of pull behind, so the weight's down on the bottom kicking up dust and stuff, and then that lure kind of comes along behind. It's a real effective way to fish deep, and also I think Tanner will probably tell us a little bit about how to use it on the river, so enjoy the show.
Absolutely.
There you go. You've been intro, Tanner. What do you got to say about the Carolina rig?
Yeah, so I have been throwing it a lot in the last year or two especially. There's, I guess, a lot to talk about. So primarily on the river, we're not fishing as deep generally. 10 feet on the river is fishing pretty deep. So most of the time, when I'm throwing it, I throw a 1/2 ounce weight with, one glass bead, 1 clacker, your swivel, and then just your standard like 4-inch size Pit Boss, or I use a V&M J-Bug because it has a lot of flapping appendages, so it floats up in the water a little bit more as you drag it through.
So when do you choose a Carolina rig over a jig or a drop shot or something else on the bottom? When do you go, oh, it's Carolina time?
Yeah, so if there's a big, say like a sand flat or a sand bar, sand drop, just a big section of water, yeah, where you're covering water. Now, not to say you couldn't drag a jig or a Texas rig through there and get bites, but I just think that the bottom contact that you get with the Carolina rig, it tells you so much more about what that bottom composition is. I can't tell you how many shell beds I found in spots that I have fished a dozen times that I never knew were there once I fished it with a Carolina rig for the first time, because you just get such a better feel for what's on the bottom. You feel every twig, you feel every shell bed, you feel everything down there. And I think that's, for me on the river, that's one of its key advantages.
So why do you think that you get better feeling with a Carolina rig versus a regular Texas rig?
I think most of it's because the bait itself is not directly attached to the weight. So the weight's able to...
So the weight's staying on the bottom.
Right, yeah. So the weight is moving a little bit more freely, making a little bit better contact with whatever happens to be on the bottom, and then transmitting that up through the line so you can feel it better.
So when we're talking about feel, typically people are Carolina rigging with cheap lead, egg-looking sinkers. Have you gotten into the tungsten?
I do both, yeah. So I have...
Is there a real difference?
In situations, yeah. So if it's just going to be rock or sand, then I'll use the lead. It's not really a big deal. There's a lot of places though where you have patchy grass, spots mixed in with sand and other stuff. And I found that the bullet weights either your standard flipping weight or your worm style weights come through that grass a lot better without it all balling up on your weight. So if you're fishing an area that does have some of that mixed vegetation, I'll definitely go to something with a little bit more of a pointed tip on it, like the flipping weight or the worm weight.
So we've heard a little bit about the history, we've heard a little bit about why we go to it. What kind of tackle are we talking for throwing a Carolina rig?
So you're talking rod and reel, right?
Rod and reel, yeah.
Yeah, so generally you want a longer rod because most of the time you've got a really long leader, or can be a long leader, so you kind of have to lob it out. It's tough to do an overhand cast. You need kind of a long rod to do that lob cast to the side. And then you're also typically just doing really long, slow sweeps with your rod, where again, that longer rod helps you move more line and move your bait through the water with each sweep. And then in addition, when a fish does actually take it, you need to be able to do a big sweeping hook set so you can take up, obviously they can sometimes move that bait relative to the weight, which can lead to a pretty big loop of line. So you just want to make sure you have a long rod so you can take up as much line as you can when you actually do set the hook.
So long rod, we're talking 7.6, 7.3, 8 foot. I mean,
yeah,
can't go wrong.
I'd say 7.6 is usually what I throw. I do have a couple 7.4s that I'll throw a Carolina rig on as well.
And reel, you can't go wrong with any. I mean, any reel can kind of work. Is there a better reel than another?
I mean, there's nothing. Granted, I don't want to say I'm an expert. I
think you want a faster gear.
I agree.
I guess what you want to say.
Yeah.
Because, like you said, when you have that bite on it and you feel the fish is moving the lure before you even know the fish is on there, you need to be able to pick that extra line up. If you're dealing with a 6-to-1 or 7-to-1 gear ratio reel, you're going to struggle. You want something a little faster than a 7.
Yeah.
Up to an 8.
100%. Yeah. And sometimes that is what happens. Sometimes the fish picks up the bait and ends up swimming over the bait towards you, and you just get a big loop of line down there, and you need to be able to pick that up quickly if that happens.
Depending on how long your leader is, that's how much longer it's going to be before you actually detect that bite.
Yep.
You segued me into my next question, Tim.
Excellent.
Leader length, size definitely matters.
Yeah. And our expert Carolina river fisherman, I'd really like to pick his brain on what length leader do you like to throw
and why?
So I'll typically start with one that's about 2 feet, and I'll fish it. If I break it, if I end up breaking off or it ends up getting scuffed from getting dragged over shells or rocks or whatever, sometimes I'll trim it down and retie until I have one that's maybe as little as a foot long. Yeah. I know there are guys they do that, but they start with ones that are 3 feet long or 3.5 feet long, super long leaders. I think it comes down to personal preference.
I'd say 18 inches to 2 feet is where I usually go for the river, unless I'm fishing around grass or something like that.
I was gonna say, I think it really depends too on what you're fishing it around. If you're fishing it around just a sandy bottom with a shell here and there, I don't think length comes that much into it. You can use it as long as you want. But if you're fishing some really chunky, gnarly rock, you don't want a really long leader, I don't think. You want to keep them pretty close together, the weight and the plastic pretty close together.
Yeah. And I've heard with the Carolina thing that the shorter leader is for more aggressive fish, and if you're looking for a more finesse-y Carolina presentation, you want longer leaders. You find that true?
More flutter.
Yeah, I could certainly see that too, and I think too, part that comes into it is heavily pressured fish. The farther you can get your weight away from the bait, so you get that bait looking as natural as possible, I think is going to be beneficial.
So I know we just filmed a Finesse video, or you guys did, and there's been a recent wave, it seems, of people doing more finesse-y Carolina rigs. Have you gotten into that? Spinning gear, shallow water. I can't remember the name of it, but it was something down south with a guy. What is it?
PD rig.
A PD rig, that's right. I thought it was something PD.
I've heard of that terminology.
So the PD rig, have you heard of this? Have you done this? You've clearly heard of it, JJ.
Yeah.
Maybe
heard of the sissy rig.
Patton's coming back in.
Thing.
Yeah, the PD rig is more of a spinning rod presentation. He uses around weeds, and he uses about an 1/8 of an ounce weight or a 1/4 ounce weight, and just basically puts a bobber stop below it, and then a finesse worm, and he uses it down in Florida, I guess, kind of in that sand grass, or whatever they call that grass that grows, 6-8 inches off the bottom, and so that weight is going through the grass, and that lure just kind of floats right above it, and it's a good finesse presentation. I've dabbled a little bit with it over the years and never really had a lot of success, but
yeah. So that's what I've heard we call a sissy rig.
Sissy rig.
Exactly that.
Yeah. I guess I didn't know what the name was for it, but I have definitely done that before.
Yeah. And what's nice about that is using the bobber stop, you can adjust the length of your leader as you go fairly easily.
And you can make it a Texas rig too. To pull
yeah. It makes it very versatile.
Yeah.
So moving on from the PD sissy rig, are you guys doing anything to your baits to make them float up? Like the swimming craw is sitting over there, and one of the nice things about the swimming craw is it's got a hollow chamber for like a rattle. But another thing you can do is throw foam in that thing to get it, up off the bottom. Are you doing any of
like a ear plug or something?
Yeah, are you guys doing any of that?
I typically don't. The only thing I try and stay with as far as keeping it buoyant is I use a monofilament leader. I don't typically use a fluorocarbon leader when it comes to a Carolina rig, and I also typically try to stick to a light wire hook. I don't want to use a super line or something like that that's a little heavy. It's going to keep it down. I want everything to just keep it fluttering as light as possible.
Yeah.
And I'd use monofilament over fluoro because mono floats and fluoro sinks.
Yep.
What are you guys using for mainline?
Typically braid, 30 pound, like a 30 pound Power Pro. 30, I mean, you can do 50, it's getting a little excessive, but 30, you keep the sensitivity with it a little better.
I'll typically do either 16 or 16 or 20 pound fluoro.
Okay.
And then for the, up to the weight, and then from the weight down to for the leader, I'll typically do like 14. Something like that.
Okay.
I think for the plastic too, one thing I want to touch on is like unsalted plastic if you can. Obviously, the idea is you want to keep this bait up and floating off the bottom as best you can. So obviously any kind of appendages that catch the water and help it stay up are going to be beneficial. Unsalted plastics, you don't want to be using any Senkos if you can avoid it.
Yamamoto Senkos.
Yeah, right, Yamamoto's. But yeah, the Z-Man plastics or any kind of that Elastec stuff, which floats by itself, I think is good. They have a, like the Palmetto Bug, I think is a great trailer for the Carolina rig. It has some appendages that kind of flutter, and that plastic in itself floats, so that's beneficial, I think. This is a Jean LaRue Biffle Bug, which, is unsalted as well and has plenty of appendages. It's nice and, it catches the water and it floats up as you drag it through, and I think as long as you stick with something like that, can't go wrong.
Until fairly recently, I just thought everyone threw a lizard on a Carolina rig. I mean, that's how I was taught. That's how everyone did it in the 80s.
When did you learn that the lizard was not the only thing to throw on a Carolina rig?
Too recently. So apparently people use other stuff. I didn't know that. They work amazing, though. I assure you.
What size lizard is your
So this one, I believe, this is the one I use. It is an 8-inch. They call this the Mag-Liz by Zoom. This is what I typically use on a Carolina rig. Although apparently I got to try all these other baits because they're pretty phenomenal.
Yeah, I know Brady's got
part of these two.
Zoom Old Monster, which is I think it's a 10-inch ribbon tail worm, which that works really well too.
The nice thing too about the Old Monster is really only half of it is a bulky worm. The other half is pure ribbon. So,
right.
Like Tanner was saying, is it with the tail, it will get up off the bottom a bit as well.
Yep.
All right. Anything you two want to add? We haven't talked about with the Carolina rig. I like throwing them. They're a great search bait, like you already mentioned. But
yeah, I like to pick up the Carolina rig on a windy day. Whenever the wind picks up a lot and I'm still trying to get down deep and offshore, that's the bait I'm thinking about, because you can put on a really heavy weight and keep bottom contact with it, and the wind doesn't really affect the performance of the bait at all. Mm-hmm. Many a times when other guys are struggling trying to throw jigs and Texas rigs and that type of stuff offshore, I'm picking up the Carolina rig and I'm still getting bites because I can throw a 3/4 ounce, 1 ounce weight on it, whatever it may be, and still keep bottom contact and feel what I'm doing. So the next time you're out there and the wind's 30-mile-an-hour gusting, think about a Carolina rig for a second. Give it a try.
It's also a decent bank option too, I think.
For sure.
Mm-hmm.
Good way to search bottom, scour
and
bottom.
learn the structure that's out there, because you're going to feel everything.
Yeah, you will.
Okay, well, very good. If there's nothing more to you guys to add, this has been another episode of Strategic Angling presented by K&K True Value in Bettendorf, Iowa, and we'll see you guys next week.
See you guys.
See ya.